The morning of August 16, 1945, broke cold and gray over San Francisco Bay. The war had ended the day before. Along the docks of Richmond Shipyard No. 3, a fleet of T-2 tankers, 375 feet of welded steel, each capable of carrying 16,000 tons of petroleum, sat motionless in the water, their hulls still streaked with salt and rust from the crossing. The smell of crude oil hung thick in the air, mixing with the fog rolling in from the Pacific. A dock worker named Thomas Brewer stood at the edge of Pier 7 that morning, looking out at the tankers lined up like sleeping whales, their gray camouflage paint flaking in the sun that was just beginning to burn through the mist. He had helped build 43 of these ships during the war. Now, he wondered what would become of them. For 4 years, American tanker ships had been the silent circulatory system of the Allied war effort. They carried fuel from Texas to England, from California to Guadalcanal, from Venezuela to North Africa. They were torpedoed, bombed, set ablaze, and sent to the bottom of the Atlantic and Pacific in numbers that still haunt maritime history. 675 American merchant ships were sunk during the war. Of those, 137 were tankers. The men who sailed them had a 1 in 26 chance of dying, worse odds than infantrymen on the front lines. Yet the tankers kept coming. American shipyards launched them faster than U-boats could sink them, faster than the Luftwaffe could bomb them, faster than Japan could interdict them. By the time the war ended, the United States had built over 5,000 merchant vessels, more than all other nations combined. Among them were over 500 T-2 tankers, the workhorses of the petroleum war. They were ugly, functional, mass-produced. They were also the reason the Allies could fight at all. But now the war was over, and the question that haunted the men like Thomas Brewer, the admirals in Washington, the economists in New York, and the sailors scattered across demobilization camps from Pearl Harbor to Liverpool was simple and enormous. What do you do with 500 tankers when the shooting stops? What happened next would reshape global commerce, redraw the map of maritime power, and transform the United States from a wartime industrial giant into the uncontested economic colossus of the 20th century. The story of America's wartime tanker fleet after 1945 is not a story of mothballs and scrap metal, though there was plenty of both. It is a story of reinvention, of geopolitical chess played on the oceans, of fortunes made and lost, of ships that refused to die, and of a nation that turned the machinery of war into the engine of a new global order. It is a story almost no one remembers. To understand what happened to the tankers, you must first understand what they represented. During the Second World War, the tanker was not merely a vessel. It was a strategic weapon, as vital as the bomber or the battleship. Oil was the blood of modern war. Without it, tanks could not move, planes could not fly, ships could not sail. Germany's entire war strategy in 1941 and 1942 pivoted on securing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was driven by the American embargo on oil exports. Britain's survival depended on the tankers that crossed the Atlantic, braving wolf packs of U-boats to deliver fuel from the refineries of Texas and Trinidad. When Winston Churchill wrote in his memoirs that, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril," he was speaking about tankers. Without them, the British war machine would have ground to a halt by 1942. The United States understood this. Even before Pearl Harbor, American strategists recognized that the war would be won or lost on the ability to move petroleum across oceans. In 1940, the U.S. Maritime Commission launched the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, an unprecedented industrial mobilization designed to flood the seas with cargo vessels. Among the designs was the T-2 SE-A-1 tanker, a standardized, mass-production oil carrier. The T-2 was not elegant. It was not fast. It was a welded steel box with engines, designed to be built quickly and cheaply. The average construction time for a T-2 was 70 days. At peak production, American shipyards were launching one every 3 days. They were built in places that had never built ships before. Cornfields in Indiana supplied the steel, women welders in California assembled the hulls, teenagers in Texas fitted the engines. The T-2 tanker was the Model T of maritime engineering, and like the Model T, it changed everything. By 1945, these tankers had carried over 300 million barrels of oil across hostile waters. They had supplied the D-Day invasion, fueled the bombers that destroyed Dresden and Tokyo, and kept the Soviet armies advancing toward Berlin. They had taken hits from torpedoes, kamikaze planes, and long-range bombers. Some had been cut in half by submarine attacks and still made it to port. Others had exploded in fireballs so intense that rescue ships could not approach for hours. The men who sailed them, merchant mariners, not military personnel, were among the unsung heroes of the war. They wore no uniforms, received no medals, and were often forgotten in the patriotic narratives that followed. But without them, there would have been no victory. And now, in the summer of 1945, they sat idle. The problem was obvious. The United States had built a merchant fleet designed for total war, and total war had ended. Peacetime demand for shipping was a fraction of wartime need. The military no longer required fuel convoys to the Pacific or supply runs to North Africa. European industries, bombed into rubble, were not yet importing oil. Domestic oil consumption was steady, but the tanker fleet vastly exceeded domestic needs. Economically, the tankers were redundant. Politically, they were a headache. And strategically, they were a potential disaster. The Maritime Commission faced a dilemma. If the government simply scrapped the fleet, it would waste billions of dollars in taxpayer investment and destroy a maritime infrastructure that had taken 4 years to build. But if the government kept the ships, it would have to maintain them, crew them, and find cargoes for them, an expensive proposition with no clear return. Worse, flooding the global shipping market with American tankers would depress freight rates, undercutting private shipping companies and igniting international trade wars. Britain, still recovering from the war and dependent on its own merchant fleet, was already nervous about American maritime dominance. The Soviet Union watched with suspicion, seeing the tanker fleet as an instrument of capitalist imperialism. Washington's solution was a masterpiece of pragmatic capitalism. Rather than scrap the ships or mothball them indefinitely, the U.S. government decided to sell them. Not to foreign governments, which would have raised strategic concerns, but to private American companies. The idea was simple. Transfer the ships from public to private hands, let the free market determine their use, and ensure that American commercial interests dominated global shipping for decades. It was, in effect, the privatization of a war machine. The sales began in 1946. The Maritime Commission offered the tankers at prices far below their construction cost, sometimes as little as $500,000 for a ship that had cost $2 million to build. The terms were generous. Low-interest loans, deferred payments, tax breaks. The government was practically giving the ships away. American oil companies snapped them up. Standard Oil, Texaco, Gulf, Mobil, all the giants of the petroleum industry, bought tankers by the dozen. Independent shipping companies, many of them founded by former merchant mariners, bought the rest. Within 2 years, over 300 T2 tankers had been transferred to private ownership. What followed was one of the great untold economic transformations of the post-war era. The tankers that had fueled the Allied war machine now became the backbone of a global oil trade dominated by American companies. They carried crude from the Persian Gulf to refineries in New Jersey. They moved gasoline from Texas to Europe. They supplied Japan's post-war reconstruction, ferrying oil from California to Tokyo Bay. They enabled the rise of the automobile culture in America, ensuring that cheap gasoline flowed to every corner of the country. The T2 tanker, designed for war, became the vehicle of American prosperity. But this was only the beginning. Not all the tankers were sold. Roughly 150 were placed in the National Defense Reserve Fleet, a mothball fleet maintained by the Maritime Commission in case of future conflict. These ships were towed to remote anchorages, the Hudson River, Sassoon Bay in California, Beaumont in Texas, Mobile Bay in Alabama, and decommissioned. Their engines were drained, their hulls were sealed, and they were coated in a protective layer of grease and plastic called cocoon preservation. They floated in silent rows, waiting. The sailors who had served on these ships during the war found this eerie. Many of them had assumed the tankers would be scrapped. Instead, the ships lingered, ghostly and inert, as if suspended between war and peace. Some sailors visited the anchorages, walking along the docks and staring at the vessels they had once crewed. They spoke of the tankers the way veterans speak of lost comrades, with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. These ships had saved their lives, carried them across oceans, survived attacks that should have sunk them. Now they were rotting in muddy backwaters, forgotten. But the U.S. government had not forgotten. In the calculus of Cold War strategy, the reserve fleet was an insurance policy. If war broke out again, if the Soviet Union blockaded Europe, if conflict erupted in Asia, if the oil supply was threatened, the tankers could be reactivated. It would take weeks, not years, to bring them back into service. They were a hedge against uncertainty, a fleet in waiting. And in 1950, the waiting ended. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, the U.S. military faced an immediate logistical crisis. American forces in the Pacific needed fuel, and they needed it fast. The commercial tanker fleet was already operating at capacity, supplying the booming post-war economy. The military turned to the reserve fleet. Within weeks, dozens of mothballed T2 tankers were being recommissioned. Workers swarmed over the ships, stripping away the preservation coatings, firing up the engines, replacing corroded parts. The tankers that had sat idle for 5 years roared back to life. Over the next 3 years, the reserve tankers carried millions of barrels of fuel to Korea. They supplied the Incheon landing, the retreat from the Yalu River, the grinding stalemate along the 38th parallel. Once again, the T2 tankers were at war. Once again, they proved indispensable. When the Korean War ended in 1953, the tankers returned to their anchorages. But the lesson was clear, the reserve fleet worked. The gamble of mothballing rather than scrapping had paid off. The same pattern repeated in the decades that followed. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, reserve tankers were activated to replace the flow of oil disrupted by the closure of the Suez Canal. During the Vietnam War, they carried fuel to Da Nang and Cam Ranh Bay. Each time, the old warships answered the call. Each time, they proved that the machinery of the Second World War still had life in it. But by the 1970s, the T2 tankers were reaching the end of their usefulness. They were small by the standards of modern supertankers, inefficient in fuel consumption, and expensive to maintain. The maritime industry had moved on. New tankers were twice as large, faster, and built with advanced materials. The T2s, once the cutting edge of naval engineering, were obsolete. And so, finally, they began to die. The scrapping of the T2 fleet was a slow, unglamorous process. One by one, the tankers were towed from their anchorages to ship-breaking yards in places like Brownsville, Texas, and Ulung, India. There, they were beached, dismantled, and cut apart. The steel was sold for scrap, the engines were salvaged, the brass fittings melted down. A ship that had crossed the Pacific 100 times, that had survived kamikaze attacks and typhoons, that had carried the fuel that powered the American century, was reduced to raw material in a matter of weeks. Some tankers met stranger fates. A few were converted into floating storage facilities, anchored off the coasts of Africa and South America. Others were sold to smaller nations, Greece, Panama, Liberia, where they continued to operate under foreign flags, their original identities obscured. One T2, the SS Marine Dow, was converted into a floating liquefied natural gas carrier, a bizarre transformation that extended its life into the 1980s. Another, the SS Pendleton, gained posthumous fame when it broke in half during a nor'easter off Cape Cod in 1952, leading to one of the most dramatic Coast Guard rescues in history. The story of the Pendleton became the basis for a book and a film, The Finest Hours, ensuring that at least one T2 tanker would be remembered. But most were forgotten. By the year 2000, fewer than a dozen T2 tankers remained in existence. Most had been scrapped. A handful survived as museum ships or floating memorials, carefully preserved by historical societies and veterans groups. The SS John W. Brown, a Liberty ship rather than a T2 but representative of the same era, still operates as a living museum in Baltimore, offering cruises and educational tours. But no T2 tanker has been preserved in the same way. The workhorses of the petroleum war have vanished, leaving behind only photographs, logbooks, and the fading memories of the men who sailed them. And yet, their legacy endures. What happened to America's wartime tanker ships after World War II was not simply a story of decommissioning and disposal. It was a story of transformation. The tankers did not merely fade away. They became something else. They became instruments of economic power, tools of Cold War strategy, symbols of American industrial might. They carried not just oil, but the promise of prosperity. They were the vessels that linked the petroleum fields of the Middle East to the factories of Detroit, the refineries of Houston to the airstrips of Saigon, the oil rigs of Venezuela to the power plants of Europe. They were the physical embodiment of a global economic order built on American terms. In this sense, the tankers never really disappeared. They simply changed form. The steel that once made up a T2's hull might now be part of a skyscraper in Shanghai or a bridge in Sao Paulo. The engines that powered them across the Pacific might have been repurposed into generators or industrial machinery. The oil they carried fueled the automobiles, airplanes, and electrical grids that defined the second half of the 20th century. The tankers dissolved into the infrastructure of modernity, invisible but essential. There is a photograph, taken in 1968, of the Sassoon Bay Reserve Fleet. It shows dozens of ships, tankers, cargo vessels, transports, anchored in neat rows, their gray hulls reflecting in the still water. The image is haunting. The ships look like monuments, like tombstones marking the graves of a vanished world. But they also look patient, as if waiting for a call that will never come. The photographer, a former merchant mariner named Harold Jensen, captioned the image with a single line, "The fleet that refuses to die." He was right. Even as the physical ships were scrapped, the spirit of the tanker fleet persisted. It persisted in the maritime industry, which adopted the mass production techniques pioneered during the war. It persisted in the oil companies, which relied on the global shipping networks established by the tankers. It persisted in the strategic doctrines of the U.S. Navy, which continued to view control of sea lanes as essential to national security. It persisted in the lives of the men who had sailed the tankers, who carried the memory of those ships until their own deaths. And it persists now, in the way we live. Every time you fill your car with gasoline, every time you turn on a light, every time you board an airplane, you are participating in a system that the T2 tankers helped to build. The oil economy, the global trade network, the American dominance of the seas, all of it traces back to those ungainly, mass-produced vessels that crossed hostile oceans during the darkest years of the 20th century. There is a philosophical paradox in the story of the tankers. They were built to serve a temporary purpose, to win a war, and yet they ended up shaping the permanent structure of the post-war world. They were designed to be disposable, and yet they proved indispensable. They were instruments of destruction, and yet they enabled prosperity. In their afterlife, they became something more than ships. They became symbols. Symbols of what? Of American abundance, certainly. Of industrial power, without question. But also of something more subtle, adaptability. The tankers succeeded not because they were the best ships ever built, but because they could be built quickly, operated efficiently, and repurposed endlessly. They were not masterpieces of engineering. They were masterpieces of logistics. They embodied the American genius for mass production, for turning raw materials and labor into functional tools on an unimaginable scale. They were the maritime equivalent of the assembly line, and like the assembly line, they changed the world. This adaptability extended to their post-war fate. Other nations, faced with surplus warships, simply scrapped them. The United States found ways to use them. The tankers became commercial vessels, reserve assets, training platforms, experimental testbeds. They were sold, leased, loaned, and converted. They were kept in service long past their intended lifespan, not because they were irreplaceable, but because they were useful. This willingness to repurpose, to extract value from the machinery of war, was quintessentially American. It reflected a pragmatic, unsentimental approach to technology, a belief that tools exist to be used, not venerated. And in using the tankers, America shaped the post-war world. The decision to privatize the fleet rather than scrap it created a commercial maritime dominance that lasted for decades. American oil companies, equipped with cheap, government surplus tankers, outcompete their European rivals and established control over global petroleum trade. American shipping companies, flush with wartime vessels, dominated international freight markets. American strategic planners, confident in the reserve fleet, pursued interventionist policies in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, secure in the knowledge that their logistical lifelines could be maintained. The tankers were not just ships. They were instruments of empire, in the softest and most effective sense of the word. In the end, the story of the tankers is a story about time. About how objects outlive their original purposes. About how the machinery of one era becomes the foundation of the next. The T2 tankers were born in the crucible of total war, but they lived through the Cold War, the oil crises, the rise of globalization. They saw the world change, and they changed with it. They were witnesses to history, and in their modest, unglamorous way, they helped to make it. Thomas Brewer, the dock worker who stood at Pier 7 in San Francisco on that August morning in 1945, lived to see the tankers scrapped. He died in 1994, at the age of 87, in a nursing home in Oakland. Before he died, he gave an interview to a local historian working on a project about wartime shipbuilding. The historian asked him what he remembered most about the tankers. Brewer thought for a long time. Then he said, "They just kept going. You thought they'd sink, but they kept going. You thought they'd rust away, but they kept going. I guess that's what America does. We just keep going." He was right. The tankers kept going long after the war ended, long after the men who built them had died, long after their original purpose had been forgotten. They kept going because they were needed. And in being needed, they became part of something larger than themselves. They became part of the machinery that turned wartime sacrifice into peacetime prosperity, that transformed industrial might into economic dominance, that carried the fuel of democracy across every ocean on Earth. The T-2 tankers are gone now. The last of them was scrapped in the late 1990s. There are no memorials, no museums, no monuments. But their legacy remains, written in the contours of the modern world. They were the ships that refused to die, and in refusing, they helped to build the world we live in today. That is what really happened to America's wartime tanker ships after World War II. They became something more than ships. They became history.